Hello, good morning. Today our guest is Professor Gerhard Meisenberg. Hello, Gerhard. How are you doing?
Hello.
All right. So, Professor, we'll be discussing a number of interesting topics today, starting with the concept of intelligence. What is intelligence?
Well, by definition, intelligence is what intelligence tests measure. And there is, of course, much debate about whether it's a unitary ability or if it's a bunch of different abilities. I would rather think it's a bunch of different abilities that just happen to correlate with each other. You may wonder why I think that way. It's because it would be neurologically implausible to have just one general ability for everything. There are abilities for memory encoding, for memory retrieval, for holding things in short-term memory, for manipulating information, and so on, and so on, and so on. So you do have different abilities, and they all together are called intelligence.
All right. So, Gerhard, what is the G factor?
The G factor is a construct that describes the positive manifold. Now, the positive manifold is the observation that when you have a bunch of different tests, of completely different intelligence-related tests that measure different cognitive abilities, you always find positive correlations among them, among all of them. For example, if somebody is good in vocabulary, chances are he will also be good at jigsaw puzzles, or at verbal analogies, or at any other thing that requires thinking ability and similar.
Yes.
And so people simply designed a procedure to capture what is in common between all these tests.
Yes,
And,
Pro.
that's called a T factor.
Okay. But Professor, what would you say to some who argue that IQ tests are biased and culturally irrelevant in certain circumstances? Is that a fair critique of IQ tests?
Well, what does bias mean? Bias would be present if there are different predictions for different kinds of people. And that is most of the time not really the case. Because what is intelligent in one place is also intelligent in another place. Of course, there are differences between different countries, for example, sometimes pretty big differences. And there are big cultural differences between these countries. But what the test is supposed to measure is simply what it's supposed to measure. And that is thinking ability.
You're right.
And thinking ability is pretty much the same everywhere. Not in level, but well, it's equally important. And the structure of intelligence is pretty similar everywhere.
You're right. It's measuring our natural ability, what we term G. So, for example, people who live in the developing world, and by developing world, I'm referring to, let's say, tribal societies who presently exist. If they were to conduct an intelligence test in the West, more than likely the numbers would vary because they may not be literate or be familiar with our concept of science. But if you judge them based on their own standards, then you will see disparities between those who are intelligent and those who are not as intelligent, because maneuvering an environment, irrespective of the climate, requires intelligence and thinking ability.
Of course, and if you apply an IQ test to people somewhere in the bush, to some pygmies in the Ituri forest, for example, you will of course find that they bomb the test. They just don't understand what they are supposed to do there. And to
Yeah.
some extent, I've seen that myself, because I have used intelligence tests in Dominica among young people and among old people. And among the older people, I found that frequently they just had difficulty figuring out what they were supposed to do, the tasks on the test. And that is something that has to be expected. Of course, these tests are strictly designed for people who have gone to school and who have a certain kind of thinking and who therefore can handle the kind of tasks on an IQ test. Analytic thinking, for example. That is something that you don't develop unless you go to school for a pretty long time.
Yes, Professor. And in all societies, there will be disparities in IQ because there are some persons who are more intelligent than others. So the argument that intelligent tests may be biased is unsupported by data. I think it's dubious because when you judge, even if you judge people based on their cultural standards, IQ will favor more intelligent groups.
Yeah, you seem to
Yeah.
have somewhat of an idea that IQ tests are meant to measure some innate ability, but they actually measure just an ability, not necessarily an innate ability, but an ability that has developed in the course of life.
Yes.
That means the tests are not meant to measure something that is necessarily heritable. They were originally developed by Binet 120 years ago in order to test school children, in order to figure out, well, how far they were advanced in school and if somebody needed special education. And Binet did not even think about inherited differences. He thought about differences in mental development that come from whatever. It doesn't really matter what causes the differences. But differences are there, and an IQ test is meant to measure the differences. It's not meant to measure anything heritable in particular.
Yes. But Prof, what explains the disparities in IQ among different groups?
Probably the same things that also explain the differences between individuals. It's some mix of genetic and environmental factors. It has to do with education, it has to be with upbringing, it has to do with the whole environment in which the child grows up.
All right. So, and again, when we're discussing intelligence, we often see some terms that are unfamiliar to laymen, like polygenetics. What's a polygene?
Okay, now inheritance of intelligence is known to be highly polygenic. That means that there are hundreds and actually thousands of genes. There can be little variations that affect the intelligence that a person can develop. There are also sometimes bigger genetic flaws that, let's say, knock 10 or 20 points of the IQ. And that happens, again, all the time in otherwise perfectly normal people. So a polygene is basically an attempt to sum all those genetic variants that we know to be associated with intelligence. There have been large genome-wide association studies that, for the most part, looked at educational attainment as an outcome variable. For example, if somebody got a college degree or whatever, or even years in school, and other studies, again, actually looked at cognitive tests, school achievement tests, IQ tests, in order to find genetic associations. These are simply statistical associations. But when there is an association, we can probably conclude that it's not the intelligence that changes the genes, but that it's the genes that have some sort of effect on intelligence. And so we have a whole big catalog of thousands and thousands of genetic polymorphisms that are statistically very, very slightly associated with intelligence. And now you sum up these variations into one single score with the aim of being able to predict to some extent a person's intelligence. And this can be done to a fairly good extent. At this point, a polygenic score predicts the intelligence of a child almost as well as the best conventional predictor, which is education of the parents. So that's the point at which we are now. So we will be able, pretty soon probably, to predict pretty much at least as well as education of the parents how intelligent the child will be. You can do it even with an embryo. If you want to choose your embryos for the ability to succeed in school, well, test them for their polygenic scores. And
Okay.
then choose the embryos with the highest polygenic score.
All right. So
That's a brave new world.
yeah, so I decided to ask these questions because the people who listen to the show really want to learn, and I like it when we define terms properly. So it doesn't make sense for individuals to use a term without knowing the true meaning. That's why I invited you, because I've been reading your work and you're a good writer. So Prof, you're also interested in the Flynn effect. During a private correspondence, you said you wanted to talk about the Flynn effect. What is the Flynn effect?
Well, the Flynn effect is a phenomenon that came as a big surprise in the 1980s when Flynn drew attention to the phenomenon. And what James Flynn found was that throughout the 20th century, there was a steady increase in IQ scores in those countries for which data were available. That means basically for the Western countries. And there was a steady increase of something like 3 IQ points per decade. That means over the whole century, the IQ has been rising by about 30 points, or about 2 standard deviations. That means that somebody who was at the 97th percentile of intelligence in 1900 was at the average intelligence in 2000. So that is a pretty massive increase in intelligence. It certainly has no genetic reasons whatsoever, but that must be caused by some sort of improvements in education, in prosperity, in other kinds of environmental conditions.
All right.
A big mystery.
But Meisenberg, I've been reading you for a while, and Edward Dutton was what is I guess I interviewed Edward Dutton some time ago, and Edward Dutton is big on the role of the genius in fostering development, like Bruce Charlton. Bruce Charlton contends that the present system is selecting against genius, but in an interview you stated basically that a genius is overrated. Would you like to expound?
Well, I'm just warning against genius worship. It's a kind of hero
Okay.
worship, but really, when it comes down to things, the genius is just a pretty bright guy. It's a pretty bright guy who happens to be in the right place at the right time, in addition, so he can do something pretty great. Otherwise, it's just a very bright person, not much
Okay.
more.
You're not very impressed by it. Very,
But
very.
geniuses are actually important because well, there must be people who really innovate, who come up with something profoundly new. James Flynn, for example, was one of these people. It doesn't mean that he got everything right all the time, but well, he happened to be the right person at the right time, and he happened to be open-minded and bright.
And this is a bit tangential to the discussion, but during an interview by Gregoire, you mentioned a book detailing Islam, and he said that intelligence in Islam declined and it is not attributed to the Mongol conquest. I don't know if you remember that interview, but I found their idea to be quite interesting. It's about contraceptive in Islam.
Yes. Now, the thing is that when you look at long-term trends, then you cannot only assume that these are intrinsic cultural developments that are at play, but you also have to consider biological mechanisms when you are dealing with timescales of, let's say, 1,000 years. 1,000 years, that's already 30, 40 generations or so. And that is enough for genetic selection to take place. Not a huge amount of genetic selection, but just raising the average IQ of the population by 2 or 3 points, or 4 or 5 points or so, may already be pretty important.
Yes,
Especially if it comes together with cultural advances that are in turn dependent on higher intelligence. And what you see over the last 1,000 years is that well, 1,000 years ago, the Middle East was great. They had scientists, they were successful in every respect, whereas Europe was pretty much a backwater. And then over the last 1,000 years, the Muslim world was slowly declining, and Western Europe was slowly rising. So you cannot really say that, there's something intrinsically stupid about the Middle East because they are so backwards today, and that Europeans are intrinsically bright people because they happen to be leading today. But no, it must be something else.
Yes, I think,
And it can actually be in parts that, the genetic background may have shifted just a tiny little bit
yeah, I,
over
th-
these 1,000 years.
yeah, I think the argument you are making is that elites in Islam had access to contraceptives, so they were having less children.
Okay, now what do we know about what happens when people start using contraceptives? Well, that happened in Europe in the 19th century, and it happened in the developing countries in the 20th century when they started limiting their reproduction. Now, who do you think starts limiting reproduction? Who starts with this whole business of contraception? Is it bright people or is it the backward people?
It's smart people.
Of course, it's the smart people. Well, we all know that education is the best contraceptive. Well, all development economists know that. It's one of the most well-established facts in the field. Now, what does that mean when suddenly the bright people use contraceptives and the not so bright people don't? And especially if that continues over centuries and millennia, and something like that seems to have happened in the Muslim Middle East, because we know from historical sources that these people were using infected contraception at the time of Muslim rule. That means since at least the 6th, 7th centuries AD.
Yeah,
And
this
so
is
it
a
is perfectly plausible to say that, yes, there might have been genetic consequences of that.
Yeah, this is a novel idea and quite unique. Prior to reading your interview with Gregoire, I wasn't so familiar with the concept. So that's why I decided to introduce it
And
to our audience.
I guess this is actually a fairly new theory, and I don't know if anybody else has ever proposed it.
Yes, I really enjoyed that interview. Quite salivating. So, Prof, we have often been told that there is a relationship between IQ and well-being. Some argue that intelligent people on average are happier, they're pro-social. What has your own research and analysis found?
Well, first at the individual level, there are some correlations of intelligence with other desirable things. For example, intelligent people typically have less psychopathology than less intelligent people. And one reason is probably that, well, if you have a good brain, chances are that you are both intelligent and you have relatively little psychopathology. And how is this possible? Well, it's possible simply because every brain is to some extent damaged by crappy genes and by other things that have acted on that brain sometime in its early life. And therefore, there is a connection between happiness and intelligence through that mechanism. But at the societal level, and also at the individual level, of course, there is a connection that intelligent people tend to be richer, and richer people tend to be happier for obvious reasons.
Yes, money allows us to purchase good experiences. And this is a fact. Scientists and other psychologists have noted this finding.
Yes, and when you look at the country level, you also find the same thing, that self-reported life satisfaction is higher in the advanced rich countries than in the poor countries.
What type of lifestyle?
Well, I say that happiness is greater generally in wealthy countries than in poor countries.
Okay, okay. I just didn't
Because
hear.
people can choose their lifestyles when they are rich, when they have more
Okay.
opportunities.
And then the other issue is pro-sociality. My own analysis is that intelligent people are able to weigh costs and benefits clearly, and as a result, they reason that it is feasible for them to be nicer to other individuals in order to get ahead. Therefore, can we truly say that intelligent people are pro-social?
Yeah, I doubt that intelligent people are really generally pro-social.
Exactly. They're manipulative.
Yeah, some of them are quite manipulative, yes. But they have figured out that they have to act as if they were pro-social.
Yes,
And that's why they are often considered more pro-social than less intelligent people who are more open in admitting that they are not all that pro-social after all.
and intelligent people are long-term thinkers. Therefore, they are
Mhm.
motivated to cooperate. So intelligent people are likely to cooperate because of selfish benefits. I they're not normally pro-social. Many people who are not very intelligent tend to be extremely nice. So
Well, some people who are not very intelligent
yes,
are indeed very nice.
yes. So
Because there's wonderful people you can really get along very well with them.
so the relationship is not a clear-cut one. Intelligent people are inspired to be nice because of what they can gain. Still on the topic of intelligence. So James Flynn identified the Flynn effect, but Richard Lane, Dutton, Woodley, and others are contending that IQ scores, when we look at general ability G, they're actually declining. What's your view?
First of all, when you use standard IQ tests, the plume effect is for real. That means IQ tests have been rising. Uh, One argument is that IQ has not been rising more for those uh, uh, highly G-loaded tests than for those that have less G-loading. And otherwise, whenever there are big differences between people, then it's usually the more G-loaded tests. That means the purer measures of intelligence that show the greatest gains. And that is part of their arguments. But actually, when you look at what abilities exactly have not risen or have even declined, you are stuck with things like reaction time, or with some very simple tests like digit span forward that require really nothing more than a quick response or just holding some information in a memory for a very short time. They are not very complex tasks, and they are tasks with very low deloading. So these are the tasks that did not improve, and they actually do come closer to the real cognitive basics in the brain that not necessarily have improved in this case. But basically, the expectation is, of course, that in the West, intelligence should be declining. Because since the middle of the 19th century, it's the less intelligent people who had more children than the more intelligent people. So genetically, there was a declining trend. There are a few studies that point in this direction that actually produced results showing that there was some decline in polygenic scores. There was, for example, a big study in Iceland that has shown that, yes, polygenic scores for intelligence did decline there over the last century, probably as a result of this genetic selection effect, differential fertility.
Yes. And another argument that's becoming quite prominent is that IQ scores are declining due to environmental factors. So, for example, dangerous chemicals in the environment. Is there a
That can, yeah, that certainly can play a role under certain circumstances. But I think that these are fairly special circumstances where people are exposed during childhood to things like mercury or lead or some other real toxic stuff. More important worldwide is probably malnutrition. Childhood malnutrition is something that is known to impair the development of intelligence. And that is still important in countries like India, for example, and in many other developing countries, where childhood cognitive development may, in many cases, be limited to some extent by poor nutrition.
Yes, yeah, there is a strong correlation between nutrition, IQ, and productivity. One writer argues that Britain had an edge because the population was healthy, and health is correlated with cognitive ability. And I can attest to the impact of nutrition and poverty. I know the socioeconomic condition can actually shape the brain. So these are serious arguments.
Yeah, well, but then before the First World War, roughly, generally Americans had better nutrition than Europeans. But still, the average cognitive achievement of Americans was probably about the same as that of Europeans at that time, even though Americans, for example, are something like 5 to 10 centimeters taller than Europeans because of their better nutrition.
Yes.
Americans were just more prosperous in the 19th century because of all the resources that they had at their disposition than Europeans. So there's probably some limited effect of nutrition, but it cannot be really an overwhelming effect that explains an awful lot. I think what explains the Flynn effect is mainly education, because we know that every year in school adds between 2 and 4 IQ points to a child's IQ during adolescence. So just raising the average length of schooling from, let's say, 6 years to 16 years in a country would raise the average IQ in the country by 20 to 40 points. It's something that is already almost enough to explain the Flynn effect. So the Flynn effect is not such a big mystery after all.
All right. I tell you, you are so adept at debunking cliches. So I would like to present another cliche. I've read studies arguing that intelligence is declining because of lifestyle factors. So, for example, people are reading less, reaction times are slower, exams are getting easier. Is there a kernel of truth to this theory?
Well, that is hard to tell because you would need a control group
Yeah.
where, let's say, some people are exposed to these conditions and others are not. And we don't really have any good studies that would compare such groups. Now, what we can say is that there are good signs, especially in Europe, that the Flynn effect has ended. That means IQs are no longer rising. For America, we don't really have good enough data. And it's somewhat contradictory what we get from America. But in many European countries, there have been reports about IQs first rising through the 20th century, and then suddenly IQs got stuck. It didn't rise anymore or even started declining again. And that's the point at which we are now.
Yeah,
So,
I think it's an exaggeration to suggest that lifestyle factors are altering the nature of intelligence. So, for example, one can increase its cognitive abilities by playing video games. Video games teach us how to strategize. So, a positive effect of a video game could be rising intelligence. But I've never seen a study like that before. But I'm just saying video games are not necessarily bad in all circumstances. Furthermore, I doubt that there is a relationship between national reading levels and intelligence, because we ought to look at the quality of what people read. So, for example, it is often said that women read more than men, but men read philosophy books, political books, and economics. Women, on the other hand, tend to be more interested in fiction, and there's a difference between fiction and reading Joseph Schumpeter. So I don't think that lifestyle changes can explain population effects.
lifestyle is notoriously difficult to measure. And we don't necessarily know what aspects of lifestyle are important. So we just don't know.
Yes.
But we definitely have to watch how intelligence develops in modern societies. I think that is one of the most important tasks of intelligence research now. That we have to see if the Flynn effect has really ended and if it possibly is going in reverse. If we see it going in reverse, that would be a bad sign, because intelligence is important for countries. It's important for the economic trajectories of nations and for their cultural level.
Yeah, we're familiar with with the notion of the smart fraction, a small percentage of individuals
Yeah.
are responsible for most innovations. And again, IQ
Uh,
tests, though important, may not necessarily be a great predictor of innovation. So, for example, Russians are very bright, but they're not as adept at translating intelligence into human capital when we look at the data. And the Americans don't do as well on PISA, but it is very innovative.
yes, that is one of the great mysteries. East Asians have higher IQs than Europeans.
Yes.
And so they should have more innovation, they should be richer and so on. But that's not really the case. Japan, for example, got stuck. There's, of course, a lot of progress in the late 20th century, but then they hit the wall, and that's pretty much it. They still have only two-thirds or so of the per capita GDP of, let's say, Britain or Germany, and even less when compared to the United States. So there is something really that keeps these nations back, and we don't really know what it is.
I think a compelling answer is the role of individualism. Individualism has many correlates, including innovation, the ability to take risk, confidence, and
Mm-hmm.
etc. Individualistic people take more risk. They're more likely to invest in the stock market. They're more confident. They innovate more because of their ability to deviate from the norm.
Mm-hmm.
And Western society, on average, is more individualistic. So I think it's cultural.
Yeah, risk taking, that is possibly one difference between
Yeah.
the different nations and the different cultures.
And then Russia is also a fascinating case study. Russians are very smart, but it is a low trust society and it's also corrupt. And there's a negative relation between IQ and national corruption. For people who are intelligent, Russians act like individuals in a developing country.
Yeah, well, the Russians probably suffered a lot under Stalinism, and they became cynics as a result. So they became selfish, they became used to lying, cheating, taking advantage of others whenever they could get away with it. Because communism failed in instilling the kind of common sense that communism was actually supposed to foster. So something went badly wrong. They went off the track.
But,
It's a
but
pity that the communist experiment failed. It was a great idea. It's just that the way it was they were trying to implement it, just didn't work. I don't know if it was the personality of Stalin, if they had perhaps had somebody else ruling the country, perhaps things would be different now.
but this is consistent with a line of research arguing that there is a positive association between markets and trust, tolerance, and diversity. I've I've often argued that non-market economies erect barriers to human interactions. So maybe the effects of communism on Russia are more pronounced in other places. I think that's something that you could study.
Yeah, well, I think that possibly one factor is that the Russians had a command economy that was strictly hierarchical, and you need autonomy at all levels in order to foster innovation and independent thinking, and also the kind of human relationships that would be necessary for cooperation. Trust chief among them. But in a command economy, you can't have that. You can't have that, for example, in modern American corporations that have CNC management, where everything goes top down. That's
Yes,
almost like in communism in some of these corporations.
yes, I agree. But I would love to now explore a very fascinating paper you did. It was published in 2020, and I'm going to share the name of it with our audience. It's about COVID, race differences in deaths from coronavirus in England and Wales, demographics, poverty, pre-existing conditions, or intelligence. Take it away.
Yes, this is a paper that was initiated by Richard Lynn, really, who happen to have IQ data of different ethnic groups in Britain, and who also got data about mortality from COVID-19 in Britain. And so he saw a connection there and a simple relationship. And so then I spent some time really pepping up that paper into something a bit more substantial. But of course, in the social sciences, everything correlates with everything else. So you cannot really say that, well, okay, there is a correlation between COVID-19 deaths and intelligence, but that doesn't prove anything, of course. Because it could be poverty, it could be just about anything.
And it could be genetics or urban populations. But we do know, but we do know that intelligent people have foresight. So, for example, prior to COVID-19, my colleague, she was consuming vitamin C, D, and E. And prior to COVID-19, I enjoyed washing my hands. So intelligent people are more likely to take responsibility for their own actions instead of reposing confidence in the state. So, for example, we're told to wear a mask or support lockdowns, but the evidence supporting the case for mask wearing is a bit inconclusive. Some studies say they're sufficient, some say no, they're not necessary. So if you're an intelligent person, then you're going to engage in mechanisms to prevent yourself from contracting the disease. You will not outsource the management of your life to the state.
Well, part of it is simply imagination. People who are not very bright probably never even think about the possibility that they could actually get infected and die of the infection, because it's unlikely, it's not something that they see happening around them, and so they don't worry too much. Whereas more intelligent people are more aware of the risks, and so they take more precautions.
Exactly. So for
Simply
example,
because of this risk awareness, because of this ability to imagine what could possibly happen.
yes, so for example, if you're exercising, you should not wear a mask. If you're walking and the climate is very hot, you shouldn't wear a mask. You can contract diseases and microorganisms can be built up in that construct. So an intelligent person is aware of the benefits and the disadvantages of so-called COVID-19 measures. They're less likely to say, okay, I'm going to wear a mask because that's what Fauci is saying. They read between the lines.
Yes, and if you're intelligent, you will probably wear a mask when there is a good reason to wear a mask.
Exactly. So if you're
but not when you're alone in the forest and there's nobody around you.
exactly, transmission in the open environment is over 0%. Secondly, children are less likely to contract the disease and to transmit it, and children need to develop speaking ability by watching our lips and how they move. So it may not be in the best interest of children for them to wear a mask. And then children don't follow instructions. They may use it to drink water or play with it. And that's another channel for them to contract diseases. So intelligent people in this context are less inclined to follow the consensus.
Yes, that is frequently the case. That intelligent people, of course, they think for themselves. They don't let others think for them. And that's, of course, why they sometimes can run into trouble when they come up with theories that nobody else likes, and that others can understand.
Yeah, like I have some weird theories myself. I contend that people comply with COVID-19 restrictions because they're lazy. They cannot fend for themselves. So it's easier to outsource these duties to the government. So the average person will not go online to read Gerhard or Mankind Quarterly in order to get new information. It's cheaper for him to just listen to Fauci.
Yes, of course, for most people, it's just the recipe that always works. Just do what you are told to do.
But Gerard, what about the role of genetics? I read a study in JAMA saying that blacks are more likely to contract the disease because of genetics, and then upper class blacks who work in the health system are also more likely to succumb to the disease, though they're not living in urban spaces and they may be less exposed to racism and discrimination.
Yeah, well, of course, it could be that there are biological differences where some races are perhaps a bit more susceptible than others, but I don't see really much of any evidence for that. You have that also in other kinds of medical conditions, like in prostate cancer. In America, black men have a much higher rate of prostate cancer than white men. But in Africa, you don't see that. Men in Africa have lower rates of prostate cancer than white men in America. So there must be environmental conditions also. Although in America, you can of course argue, yeah, well, they live in the same country, pretty much the same kind of lifestyle, they eat the same kind of fast food or whatever, and so they should have the same rate. And when there is still a difference, even in America, then that's probably genetics. And with susceptibility to COVID-19 or just about anything else, you encounter the same kind of questions.
Maybe in
But
Africa,
it all needs to be studied in depth before we can really say what the
yes,
causes are.
maybe in Africa it's a case of gene culture coevolutions. I'm just suggesting a theory. I think sometimes we underestimate microevolutionary processes.
Yes, one possibility is that people in Africa are exposed to a much broader range of pathogens, of viruses, of bacterial diseases, of parasitic diseases, and therefore the immune system in Africa is possibly actually better than the immune systems of people in Western countries, where there is less exposure to all these pathogens. That, by the way, is also the reason or the likely reason why in Western countries you have so many people having autoimmune diseases and allergies, like asthma, for example, or type 1 diabetes. It's much more common in the West than, for example, in Africa.
Yes, I actually read a piece, and the writer argued that maybe Africans are less susceptible to the disease because of their blood type.
Well, with blood types, I'm not sure
Yeah.
because COVID-19 is something that affects more likely the lungs, but not so much the blood cells. And Africans have often peculiar traits on red blood cells because they were exposed to malaria. And then things like the sickle cell mutation and thalassemia and such stuff that got selected for in Africa under the influence of malaria.
And that's a really good example of gene culture coevolutions.
Mm.
I would introduce to the argument as an anthropology student about 7 years ago, and since then I've been a fan of anthropology and people like yourself. The article was published by the BBC. Now we're going to divert a bit to discuss another compelling piece. How does racial diversity raise income inequality? But before we do so, I will be sharing my own view. Oded Gaylor is a leading scholar in the field of genetics and diversity and how diversity can impact conflict. And he produced a study some years ago noting that in Africa, ethno-linguistic fragmentation predicts conflict. However, ODED did a new study submitting that diversity negatively affects trust across populations. So conflicts are affected through the channel of people not trusting each other. However, if citizens are able to collaborate, let's say for example, they elect a suitable leader who can motivate them to believe in the national goal, then we benefit from diversity because diversity has pros and cons. With more diversity, newer ideas. Too much diversity, it may deter social capital. So my own view is that diversity is a negative if we cannot get people to respect each other and cooperate. So a plural society can work, but respect is the objective factor. But you can go ahead and talk about your paper and then you may respond to my argument.
Yeah, well, the question there was really are countries that are more diverse let's say people, let's say countries like Latin American countries. You have, let's say, a Native Amerindian people and black people and white people and mestizos all living together or living next to each other in the same country, whether they have more income inequality than homogeneous countries, like, for example, the Scandinavian countries. And broadly, worldwide, that seems to be the case. But there is, of course, a question of what kind of diversity is really important. In Africa, it's ethnic diversity, because you have all these different tribes and nations. You have Igbo and Yoruba and whatever. And they, of course, sometimes don't agree with each other. So there's a sort of conflict there. And that's why you have a lot of civil war there in some of these countries. But in Latin America, it's completely different. There you have populations that are mixed up. You have mestizo populations that are part European, part Amerindian, and then some Africans mixed in, and whatever. And that is, of course, a completely different situation. And in America and in Europe, you again have different situations. For example, in America, they found that solidarity at the local level declines when there is more diversity. So diversity has a negative effect, it seems, on American communities. But when people try to do the same in Europe, they found that this is not usually the case in European countries. I don't know if it's the type of ethnic and racial diversity that in Europe that is different from what you have in America, or if it's the attitudes of the people, perhaps there are cultural differences, because there's a difference perhaps because in America you have this diversity for a long time already. And in Europe, it's something new. It's all migrants that came in over the last 50 years or so. So we don't know. But what is certain, I think, is that when you have a diverse society, you need a certain kind of a value system in order to maintain the peace. And I think that this value system has to discourage any kind of ethnocentrism. It has to discourage the habit of treating people as members of a particular race or nation. It's much better when people just treat each other as individuals. And that's what is done in the Caribbean, and it seems to work well in the Caribbean. And I think that America would be in much better shape if the Americans would do the same instead of having these competing racisms. And that's really what we see in America now. You have the traditional racism, and then you have the inverted racism that you have now on the left wing.
But
And that is real bad when you say that basically racism can be fought only with racism.
yes, the response of the left to racism is quite pernicious. But interestingly, studies do show that America has succeeded at assimilating immigrants. Maybe we're presently experiencing a change, but historically, Americans have been more adept at mitigating the conflict associated with ethnic diversity.
Yes, and this is because America is a traditional immigration country, and therefore Americans have always integrated people who came in, first from Europe and then from Mexico and other places. And therefore, intrinsically, Americans are much better at that than Europeans. And within Europe, it's the Eastern Europeans who are most xenophobic because they don't have that history of migration and diversity. They are used to live in ethnically homogeneous countries, or at least in local areas that are ethnically homogeneous.
Yeah, and the concept
And
of
so,
yeah, and the
yeah.
concept of civic nationalism is more potent in America. So, for example, as a student, I was taught that one became it was I was taught as a student that was it that it is not easy for one to become a Frenchman. So remember, the French Revolution popularized nationalism, but historically, being a French, being born in France did not automatically result in one becoming a Frenchman. Whereas by migrating to America, you became American in the Japanese are not very friendly to immigrants. If you It's hard to migrate to Japan, and it's even harder to assimilate. France is an older country, but it's very diverse at the local level. So the concept of a Frenchman will vary from town to town. Whereas in America, you're an American. If you're born in America, you're an American. If you love America, you're an American. So the civic nationalism is beneficial, although today there is much debate as to the relevance of civic nationalism on the right. Mm.
Yes, now in America, of course, it's a matter that on the right, on the left wing, basically, you have racists, and on the right wing, you have nationalists. That means the left wingers, they emphasize, the situation of different races, and that Black Americans have a different history from white Americans, and so on. On the right wing, you find the nationalists who basically say we are all Americans. It doesn't matter who we are, what our color
The,
is.
the civic nationalists, they're very
And
different from the ethno nationalists.
yes, there are also ethno nationalists, but they are probably relatively small.
Yeah, it's a
I
minority
mean,
group.
the more mainstream conservatives.
Yeah, I've interviewed a bit, and then there is another point that often elicits controversy: the relationship between welfare and diversity. Immigration is less popular when the state is diverse, and the reply is usually that people are unlikely to support foreign groups. So I'm willing to be taxed to invest in my neighbors who are Americans, but I'm not going to use my hard-earned resources to fund someone from Nigeria.
Yes, that's possibly a reason why America does not have the great welfare system that you find in the European countries. Because, mainstream white people are reluctant to share their wealth with Black people and Hispanics and all kinds of other folks.
And I would also like to say that there is a magnet effect in the realm of welfare. In other words, migrants do migrate to welfare state. This has actually been proven by empirical research. So welfare
Yes,
attracts migrants.
yes, that is because a welfare state is generally better than a more libertarian state for generally for the poorer people. Those who are more likely to get into trouble when they lose a job or whatever. And of course, for poor people generally, a good welfare state is better than a country like America, where there isn't that much provision when you get into trouble.
Yet on the flip side, some argue that immigration can actually improve the quality of institutions because of the welfare effect compounded by anti-immigration sentiments. People are less likely to support the growth of the state. Therefore, if you're on the political right, you should actually like immigrants, because indirectly immigration will reduce the scope of the welfare state.
Well, yes,
Yeah,
exactly.
Cato did
Yeah,
that study recently.
if you are against the welfare state, you should be in favor of immigration.
Yeah, that study was recently produced by Cato, and the mainstream media did not pay significant attention to. But I have an article. The article was published by Chronicles. I just find it really interesting and funny at the same time. The paradox, the conservative paradox of the welfare state. Okay, and a very compelling response is the case of Singapore. Singapore is diverse, but they appointed Lee Kuan Yew to lead, and he managed to ensure conformity and love at the same time. People were even forced to live together in the same complex. As a libertarian, I'm not necessarily in favor of such policies, but I do see how a leader like Lee Kuan Yew can reduce or modify the effects of ethnic diversity.
Yeah, and in Singapore, they actually did it pretty much without a lot of affirmative action. They had, of course, programs to support the lower achieving parts of the population. and that actually worked out reasonably well. And so there wasn't really that much need for a quota system or something of that sort, the way the Indian government, for example, is doing that with their disadvantaged cases.
Yes, but Gerard, there's a paper you wrote. It's a bit similar to the piece we're presently discussing, but there are also some obvious differences. Multiculturalism and inequality. Why would multiculturalism increase inequality?
Yeah, but in this case, multiculturalism simply refers to a great diversity in the country. I mean, otherwise, you can, of course, say that there is a difference between multiculturalism and assimilation. When you have migrants, should you ask them to assimilate, that means to become just like the people in the country to which they migrate, or should they maintain their own identity, their own individual culture? And here we again don't really know for sure what is the better strategy. It's probably a matter that is different from case to case. There's certainly a kind of diversity that is desirable that we should even try to maintain, while other differences are perhaps not so good, and we should insist on assimilation.
But some could opine that multiculturalism as a policy would result in the redistribution of wealth.
It will certainly result in redistribution of wealth, but then the question is, of course, should the wealth be redistributed and to what extent generally in the country? You don't need to specifically consider any particular ethnic groups or immigrant groups or whatever that are living in the country, but the important groups in the country are really the rich and the poor. That's the big division. And well, ethnically diverse countries like America tend to forget about that and focus too much on ethnic and racial differences instead.
All right, but Gerard, based on how multiculturalism is being practiced, I can see how it impacts inequality. So, for example, the concept of positive discrimination. Educated people are more educated people tend to be wealthier and they're more likely to attend universities. Therefore, when leftists argue that we should discriminate in favor of minorities, wealthier minorities are being privileged. So again, promoting multiculturalism can create income disparities in
Mm.
minority communities because the beneficiaries of affirmative action are not poor
Mhm.
blacks or poor Indians.
Yeah, well, affirmative action is a problematic policy
Very.
because it's a zero-sum game. That means when you favor one group, then you disfavor some other group. And therefore, there is much concern now about discrimination against Asians in America, for example, because they tend to be high achieving. And of course, there is a problem when Harvard says, oh no, we discriminate against Asians because otherwise half of our students would be Asian.
But Asians do well in school because they strongly assert that success is not innate. In order to achieve, one must study and work hard. So
Mhm.
Asian culture is influencing their rates of academic success.
Because it is certainly useful to believe that ability is not innate. Because you should always tell people that yes, they should put a lot of effort, and that it depends on their own effort what they achieve, even if there are actually some genetic limitations.
Yes, thinking that you're naturally bright can make you lazy sometimes. But the issue of Asian racism in America, that's a topic for another discussion. So, for example, many of the perpetrators are blacks, but we cannot pinpoint that because of anti-racism is teaching us that people of color are virtuous, so they can't be racist. So it's really just silly and sometimes annoying and downright confusing. But Gerhard, you also produce another innovative paper measuring academic performance across several countries. You looked at boys relative to girls. Girls are doing well. Why, Gerard?
Well, girls are doing well in school because, they are more docile. That is at least the common interpretation. That means they do what the teacher tells them and they learn what they are supposed to learn, and therefore they do better than boys in school achievement tests. At least in most subjects, not necessarily in mathematics, but certainly in reading. So on average, when you average all, yes, girls do better in school than boys. They look smarter, but on IQ tests, you don't really see that. You see that only on tests that really test things that are closer to what is learned in school. And otherwise, IQ differences between boys and girls and between men and women are small overall, and they are different for different kinds of abilities. There are tests on which males are better, and there are tests on which females are better. And these differences tend to be fairly consistent across different countries and cultures, and therefore may very well have a genetic background. So don't necessarily expect that about 50% of all electricians should be female, or that 50% of all nurses should be male. Perhaps there are really slight differences in different kinds of abilities, and especially, of course, in preferences between males and females.
Yes, most beauticians are women. Even in the cosmetics industry, women are likely to start small cosmetics companies. Women talk about beauty. There's a market for female beauticians.
Hmm.
Interests are different. Boys play with toys. Even when parents do not socialize boys and girls to act like their respective sex, they do act like how we expect them to perform.
Yes, so there have even been studies about, for example, girls who were exposed to high levels of androgens before birth because of a metabolic defect. And so the brain was in part masculinized by these male hormones before birth. And well, these girls, they don't play with dolls, they play with cars.
And then studies also show that the brains of homosexual men and women reflect the opposite the opposite sex. So a male homosexual has some similarities with a woman, and a female homosexual has similarities with a man.
Yes, that has been described for some, I think, some nuclei in the hypothalamus where homosexuals are more similar to the opposite sex. And that is actually not very surprising, of course, because something in the brain must be different between homosexuals and heterosexuals.
Exactly, and we don't need to explore the gay gene. There's no need to say, oh, homosexuality is wrong because there's no gay gene. One can make a case against homosexuality without invoking genetics.
Yeah, well, actually, those people who are most tolerant of homosexuals tend to be also those who believe most in genetic causes of homosexuality. Now, the truth is, of course, that both genes and environmental factors are important. Now, genes are important because, well, not everyone becomes homosexual, only some people.
Of course, genes are important, but
Yeah,
there isn't a specific gene coding for homosexuality.
no, no, there are probably again hundreds of genes,
Yeah,
thousands of genes, actually thousands of genetic polymorphisms in who knows how many genes that can affect the likelihood that somebody becomes homosexual
and there's
or
also a
transsexual or whatever.
perspective that homosexual men, their relatives are more productive in terms of fertility, both their female relatives and male relatives. I've seen
That
many,
is frequent.
yeah, I have seen many
That's
studies making this point.
yes, there's a frequent suspicion that possibly those genes that make it more likely for a man to become homosexual, that they can, for example, increase maternal behavior in females or in both males and females, perhaps, and thereby increase reproduction in those who carry the gene, but without becoming homosexual.
Yeah, the
So that is very well possible.
yeah, the topic is really interesting, but we have to revert back to intelligence. I want to talk about the spatial abilities of men. Why do men possess stronger spatial abilities? If there's an answer,
Well, the evolution,
evolution.
well,
Okay,
there's
explain.
evolutionary explanation, of course. The evolutionary explanation is that the women had to stay close to the home cave because they had to carry children around, so they couldn't run so fast. So they usually stayed close to home, and it wasn't all that important for them to learn how to find their way in environments that they are not that familiar with. Whereas the men had to range far and wide to look for animals to hunt or for enemies to kill, and therefore they had to make sure that they wouldn't lose their way on these forays. And therefore, males evolved better spatial skills and better wayfinding skills than women.
Yeah, this is an exquisite explanation, but it really doesn't explain male dominance. And again, I'm digressing a bit. So, for example, Esther Basirop, the famous Dutch economist, she said that agriculture gave men an advantage. But Anthony Ludovici, in during his time, he was very popular, but he's not famous today. Ludovici argues that in societies where status is not based on physical prowess, men are still dominant. So I don't think you are correct, re spatial abilities, but the broader issue of male dominance is not closely related to the environment or agriculture.
Yes, now the reason for male dominance is mainly that, okay, humans have dominance hierarchies. And human societies always had dominance hierarchies of males and of females. And usually, those who were higher up in the dominance hierarchy had greater reproductive success than those who were lower down in the hierarchy. And the extent to which this contingency existed was apparently stronger in males than in females. That means that a low-ranking female well still found somebody to keep her pregnant and possibly enough help to raise her children. But in the case of the males, they were fighting over the females, and therefore they had to have a stronger striving for success in these power struggles. And because of this stronger ambition to succeed in the dominance hierarchy, that's why males are generally dominant over females.
Yes, and remember, Gerhard, that men in the past, well, not men, but powerful men in the past monopolized women and resources. So they were more reproductive. So essentially, most of us are the descendants of very, very dominant men. So I
Yes,
think that's
exactly.
another factor that should be explored.
Yes,
Genghis Khan and his descendants.
exactly. Striving for dominance involves, for example, risk taking because you have to fight your opponents, and therefore risk taking and striving for dominance and power. That is therefore more strongly developed in males than in females because in males it produces a greater reproductive return. For the woman, the problem is not so much to achieve power over others in order to dominate and in order to get access to more mates, as in the case of males. But the main problem for the woman was to ensure that her children would survive. It means women needed social skills to function in an environment where they needed some male help. So they had to develop the respective skills. But striving for great dominance was not really an important part of that toolkit for the
Y-
woman.
Yes, no returning to intelligence. The concept of male dominant versus female dominant is just too interesting for us to ignore. But we have to keep focus and return to intelligence. In your paper, you write, it is frequently held that modernization in the social and political domain is emancipatory in the sense that it reduces disadvantages for several allegedly disfavored groups, including women. This hypothesis predicts that reduced discrimination in more enlightened and socially and politically more advanced societies reduces sex differences, including the cognitive differences that are tapped by scholastics achievement tests. But your results are not so clear cut. To expound a bit.
Yes, the results show that there is no indication really of such an effect at all. And actually, in the case of personality differences, what researchers have found is that the sex differences in personality tend to be actually larger in the more gender egalitarian and economically more advanced societies than in developing countries. So when you look at differences between men and women in voticism and agreeableness and conscientiousness and stuff like that, you find that these differences are greater in America or in Europe than, for example, in India or in Arab countries or in Africa. And the good explanation for that is that in the Western countries, women can really afford to follow their own preferences.
Yes.
And there are more different slots for males and females, so that males can find social roles that conform to their own preferences, and women can find social roles that conform to their preferences. So they can develop their own preferences more independently, more freely than in poor countries where men and women have to work hard equally.
Yes. When
The
women
survival is simply the problem.
when women have the choice to succeed, they're not motivated to fixate on money, the luxury of affluence. This is a consistent finding in many empirical and psychological studies. In gender egalitarian countries, women tend to be employed in stereotypically female professions.
Yes, of course, we have a lot of professions that are completely dominated by females, and that number of professions has been rising over the last decades. So women do have the possibility to follow their own preferences in modern societies. And in traditional societies, they don't really necessarily have these opportunities. Their gender roles are more clearly fixed. That's true, and they're different. They're not exactly the same, but there's also less freedom for both men and women to choose what they want to do, but what exactly their preferences are. It's much more constrained, and because things are more constrained in poorer countries, that is probably why there are less gender differences in personality traits and preferences.
Yes, but
Men and women just have to be the same because they face the same problems in life.
and reading your paper, it was implied both implicitly and sometimes explicitly that in some patriarchal societies, women tend to do better than men. That was communicated to me quite often.
Yeah, well, certainly it has nothing to do with discrimination against women or whatever. It's hard to find any empirical evidence for something that would really indict anything like discrimination as an important factor, at least in modern societies.
Yeah, I'm proposing a
It's a matter of
novel.
preferences.
Yeah, I am proposing a novel hypothesis. For example, in patriarchal societies, men are usually powerful. In your paper, you note that in these societies, people prefer men to attend university, but your findings do not support that men are more likely to attend university. So my own argument is that patriarchy selects against modern trends in male communities. For instance, men are in a patriarchal society are encouraged to be warriors. So whereas a girl is told to socialize, conform, and do well. In other words, a modern society prefers girls. They conform, they follow instructions, they play by the rules. Men are told to be dominant, and sometimes in patriarchal societies, because men are encouraged to fend for the family, they're less likely to attend university. So in the long term, patriarchy is actually hurting men by selecting against traits associated with modernity. I have not tested it, but it's just my idea.
Yeah, that is very well possible. And now there is a new paper, it's not yet published, from Saudi Arabia. They look at intelligence of teenagers in two places. In the capital city of Riyadh, or Riyadh, which is very conservative. That is a real conservative type of Islam there, where there are lots of restrictions on women. And the other place where they did the study was a coastal city where things are much more liberal. And they compared then the intelligence of males and females in these two locations. And they found that in the conservative place, where there were strict gender hierarchies and gender inequality, the girls scored higher than the boys. Whereas in
Expected.
the more liberal place, it was about equal, or the boys were even a bit better than the girls. And the interpretation of the researchers was that in the conservative place, females are pretty much restrained, they are restricted to stay in the house. And for teenage girls, it means that instead of fooling around outside the house, they stay at home and they study.
Exactly,
They
because
train their intelligence, and that's how they get higher IQ
yeah,
scores
yeah,
than the
yes,
males.
because patriarchal in patriarchal societies, men are basically encouraged to express tendencies that are archaic and in
So yeah,
consonant with modern society. So if you're a man, you can conquer the world. So why go to school? Whereas girls are submissive. They're supposed to go to school and work. So even though implicitly patriarchal societies want men to be educated, indirectly they select against education.
yes, exactly. You
Yes.
have all these unintended consequences in the social sciences, things that people don't even think about, but that are perhaps not all that unpredictable.
No, it's not. It's really a touchy topic, but I would love to see that paper. Who wrote it?
That was written by some people in Saudi Arabia.
Oh, in Saudi Arabia, and
It's usually people in these countries who do these studies themselves, often in collaboration with somebody who sits somewhere in Europe or elsewhere.
yes, but
In this case, I
before,
think there was a collaborator in Germany who worked with these people in Saudi Arabia.
so
Mhm.
Gerard, before we wrap up, I must share this story. Girls who get straight A's in school do not necessarily do better than boys who fail, and it's obvious. In the real world, personality is more important. Confidence is highly significant. So if you're a confident person, when you only possess a bachelor's degree, you're going to apply for a job requiring a master's. Girls work hard and expect to be rewarded because they work hard, but boys know better. Boys are aware that
Yes.
working hard does not mean that you're brilliant or that people will respect your effort.
Yeah, well, credentialism is not a really good attitude. It's not only a bad policy, it's also a bad attitude to rely on some diploma, some certificate or so. Now, what is really important in life, I think, are three things. First, there's intelligence. We need to have some sort of intelligence to succeed. Secondly, there are social skills. There are lots of intelligent people who just don't have the social skills, who are perhaps on the autistic spectrum or whatever, and that's why they cannot succeed. And the third important factor is psychopathology. If you're kind of goofy and have weird ideas, then possibly you won't succeed even if you have social skills and are intelligent. So these three things, they should come together in some sort of mix in order to make for a successful life.
All right. So, Gerhard, I really enjoyed this interview. How do you grade it? How was it for you?
So, well, I think it went fine.
Yeah, I like to ask these questions. I'm a bit worried. I've never been tested, but I could be mildly autistic. Yeah, yeah,
And I always thought I'm the autist.
yeah. I could be mildly autistic, but Gerard, we need to have a bigger discussion. So one of these days, I'm going to have a multi Zoom discussion. So I'm going to send an email to you, and if people like Duchan agree, we can have many people on Zoom talking about these controversial topics.
Okay, if you want to organize something, fine.
Yes,
Just let me know.
yes. Thanks for coming, and at some point you'll be invited again. Bye.
Yeah,
All
was a
right.
pleasure.
Yeah.
Bye.